An elderly woman was kicked out of the country club, only to later announce she was the new owner. Margaret Wilson smoothed the collar of her powder blue cardigan as she walked through the polished oak doors of Oak Ridge Country Club. At 72, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from decades as one of Burlington's most respected high school principals. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, catching the silver in her meticulously styled hair as she made her way to her regular table for Friday afternoon tea. "Good afternoon, Thomas." She nodded to the maitre d', who had greeted her every Friday for the past 23 years. Today, however, his usual warm smile was replaced with an uncomfortable grimace. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, lowering his voice. "Oh, I'm afraid I need to speak with you privately." The hushed conversation that followed in the small office near the kitchen would replay in Margaret's mind for weeks. Her membership had been reviewed by the board. There were new financial requirements and updated membership standards. The carefully chosen words barely disguised the truth. The new management company that had taken over Oak Ridge 6 months ago was pushing out older members to make way for younger, wealthier families. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Wilson," Thomas concluded, unable to meet her eyes. "Today will be your final day at Oak Ridge." The dining room fell silent as Margaret walked out. She felt the weight of pitying glances from members who had heard rumors of the membership review. Some looked away, suddenly fascinated by their menus. Others, who had known her for decades, who had attended her retirement party, whose children she had guided through adolescence, simply stared into their water glasses. Only Eleanor Blackwell, her closest friend since college, rose from her seat and crossed the room. "They can't do this, Margaret. It's outrageous." "They already have," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. She reached for her handbag, grateful that her hands weren't trembling. "Would you mind driving me home? I don't think I should be behind the wheel right now." As Eleanor's car pulled away from the club's circular driveway, Margaret finally allowed herself a single tear, quickly wiped away. Through the window, the sprawling colonial-style clubhouse grew smaller, its white columns and perfect landscaping a painful reminder of what had just been taken from her. "This isn't over," Eleanor said firmly, gripping the steering wheel. "Richard knows people on the board. We'll fight this." Margaret said nothing, watching raindrops begin to speckle the windshield. Her mind wasn't on fighting the decision. Instead, she was remembering a conversation from 3 months ago with her late husband's attorney about investments, real estate holdings, and a sealed envelope not to be opened until a specific date. That date was next Tuesday. The law offices of Harrington and Palmer occupied the entire 14th floor of Burlington's tallest building. Margaret stepped off the elevator on Tuesday morning, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. She had barely slept the previous night, her mind racing with possibilities. James Palmer, her late husband Edward's attorney and friend for 40 years, greeted her with a gentle hug. "You look well, Margaret." A small lie between old friends. The dark circles under her eyes told a different story. I believe we have an appointment about Edward's final instructions," she said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. James nodded, retrieving a sealed envelope from his safe. "Edward was very specific about the timing. He said you would understand when the moment came." Margaret broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a thick document and a handwritten letter in Edward's familiar, precise handwriting. As she read, her breath caught. This can't be right," she whispered. "I assure you it is," James replied. "Edward made the initial investment 30 years ago through a series of shell companies. The final paperwork was completed just before his passing. Edward Wilson, her pragmatic, methodical husband of 48 years, had secretly purchased controlling interest in Oak Ridge Country Club through a complex series of investments. More surprisingly, he had arranged for the property management company that now ran the club to be partially owned by Margaret herself, though she hadn't known it until this moment. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" she asked, scanning the documents that confirmed her new status as majority owner. James smiled sadly. The letter explains his reasoning. Edward always played the long game. The attorney poured her a glass of water, giving her a moment to process the revelation. See, he came to me about this plan after you both were denied membership the first time, back in '93, James explained. He never forgot how they treated you, claimed the club was at capacity when everyone knew what that really meant. Margaret remembered that day. Edward's quiet fury as they drove home, the way he'd gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. She'd told him to let it go, that it didn't matter. Clearly, he never had. "Eight, there's more," James said, handing her another folder. "Financial reports from the last 5 years. The club has been struggling under its old management model. Edward anticipated this. He knew the old guard would eventually be forced to sell. So he waited," Margaret murmured, beginning to understand the scope of her husband's foresight. "For decades," James confirmed. He said it was the best investment he'd ever make. Not for the money, but for the look he imagined on your face today. Later that evening, alone in the house they had shared for nearly 5 decades, Margaret reread Edward's letter by the firelight. His words, explaining how he had watched the club's old money membership subtly exclude people like themselves, who had earned rather than inherited their comfort, brought both tears and a slow-building resolve. "Ace, the club will change hands publicly next month," he had written. "When it does, you'll have a choice to make. I've given you the power to either sell your interest for a considerable profit or to step in and remake Oak Ridge into what it always should have been, a place of true community rather than exclusion." Outside, a spring storm lashed rain against the windows. Margaret set the letter down and picked up her phone. "Eleanor? It's me. I need your advice on something important." For 3 weeks, Margaret observed Oak Ridge from a careful distance. She drove past at different times of day, noting the luxury vehicles in the parking lot. She read the club's newsletter, which Eleanor still received, studying the new management's changes, higher fees, younger members, a growing emphasis on exclusivity. She also met discreetly with Thomas, the maître d', at a coffee shop downtown. His loyalty to the club's traditions, rather than its new management, made him a valuable source of information. "They're planning to announce a complete renovation next month," he confided, stirring his coffee nervously. "The older buildings will be demolished. They're calling it progress, but it feels like erasing history." Margaret nodded, thinking of the clubhouse where she had celebrated her 40th wedding anniversary, where Edward had been honored after his retirement from the university. "And the staff, many of us will be let go," Thomas admitted. "They want younger faces to match their new image." That evening, Margaret met with James Palmer again, this time with a clear plan forming. "I want to attend their announcement ceremony," she said. "Can you arrange it?" James raised an eyebrow. "You're the majority owner, Margaret. You can do more than attend." The day of the ceremony arrived with perfect early summer weather. The club's new CEO, Michael Brantley, had arranged for local press to cover what he called Oak Ridge's evolution into the future. Members gathered on the perfectly manicured lawn, champagne flutes in hand, as Brantley approached the podium. Margaret arrived dressed in a tailored navy suit, a string of pearls at her throat, Edward's last birthday gift to her. She stood at the back of the crowd, unnoticed by most. Eleanor remained close by, barely containing her curiosity about what Margaret had planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brantley began, his voice carrying across the lawn, "today marks the beginning of an exciting new chapter for Oak Ridge. Our renovation plans will transform this good club into a great one." Polite applause followed as he detailed changes that would increase exclusivity while erasing much of what Margaret and others had valued about Oak Ridge. "And now," Brantley continued, "I'd like to introduce our primary investor, who has chosen to remain anonymous until today." He gestured toward the side of the stage, clearly expecting someone, but not Margaret Wilson, who was now making her way steadily through the crowd. A murmur rippled through the gathering as Margaret approached the podium. Michael Brantley's smile faltered, his eyes darting to his assistant in confusion. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, lowering his voice as she reached him. "This is a private club function. I believe there's been some misunderstanding." "There certainly has been," Margaret agreed, her voice carrying more clearly than she had expected. She turned to face the crowd, many of whom recognized her. Some looked embarrassed, others confused. "For those who don't know me, my name is Margaret Wilson. 3 weeks ago, I was informed that my membership at Oak Ridge had been revoked after 23 years. She paused, allowing the statement to settle. "Today, I'm here to inform you that I am the majority shareholder of both Oak Ridge Country Club and the management company currently operating it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to pause their singing. Margaret felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in years, not since standing before a classroom of unruly teenagers. Power. Not the cruel kind that had been wielded against her weeks ago, but the steady authority that came with knowing exactly where you stand. Brantley's face had drained of color, his carefully cultivated poise crumbling. "This is impossible," he whispered, though the microphone caught his words. "We've reviewed all ownership documentation." "Perhaps not thoroughly enough," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She caught sight of the board chairman, Harold Winters, whose expression had shifted from shock to calculating interest. He'd always been a pragmatist above all. A camera flashed. Someone from the local paper had been invited to cover the renovation announcement. Now they had a far more interesting story. Margaret hadn't planned on media attention, but she wouldn't shy from it either. Margaret produced the documents James had prepared, handing them to a stunned Brantley. "You'll find everything in order." She turned back to the microphone. "My late husband Edward made this investment decades ago, believing that someday Oak Ridge might need to be reminded of its original purpose, not as a barrier between people, but as a gathering place for a community." From the corner of her eye, Margaret could see Eleanor beaming. Nearby, Thomas and several other longtime staff members watched with undisguised delight. "There will be changes at Oak Ridge," Margaret continued, "but they won't include excluding our senior members or dismissing staff who have given decades of service. This club has always been about more than golf courses and tennis courts. It's about the connections formed here, the celebrations shared, the community built within these grounds." As she spoke, Margaret noticed different reactions among the crowd. Some of the newer members appeared displeased, whispering among themselves. Others, particularly those who had known her for years, seemed relieved. Later, in the clubhouse library that had always been her favorite room, Margaret met with the board of directors. The conversation was tense at first, with Brantley and his allies clearly calculating their options. "Your husband's investment was quite unorthodox," one board member suggested. "Edward was many things," Margaret replied calmly, "but never conventional. He believed in planning for contingencies." By evening, word had spread throughout Burlington. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Old friends, former colleagues, local reporters seeking comments. She answered none of them, preferring to sit quietly on her porch as twilight settled over her garden, considering the path ahead. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of diplomacy and determination. Margaret worked closely with James to understand the legal complexities of her position, while also building alliances with board members who shared her vision for Oak Ridge. Not everyone was pleased. A faction led by Brantley attempted to challenge Edward's acquisition through legal channels, claiming irregularities in the paperwork. The effort failed quickly when James produced documentation of every transaction, meticulously organized in Edward's precise manner. "Oh, your husband was thorough," James told her after the challenge was withdrawn, almost as if he anticipated resistance. "Edward taught mathematics for 40 years, Margaret replied with a small smile. He believed every problem had a solution if you worked through it systematically. By midsummer, Margaret had established her authority at Oak Ridge, though she wielded it thoughtfully. She reinstated members who had been pushed out, but also introduced new membership options that made the club more accessible to families of various income levels. A controversial move that she defended vigorously. Exclusivity based solely on wealth doesn't build community, she explained at a contentious board meeting. It merely creates artificial barriers. On a warm August evening, Margaret hosted a reception for the club's staff, everyone from groundskeepers to administrative personnel. Many shared stories of feeling undervalued by the previous management, of fearing for their livelihoods despite years of dedicated service. Thomas, now promoted to club manager, raised a toast to Mrs. Wilson, who reminded us that Oak Ridge is not just buildings and bylaws, but people and principles. Later that night, walking the grounds alone after everyone had gone, Margaret paused by the memorial garden where some of Edward's ashes had been scattered. The air was heavy with the scent of late summer flowers and freshly cut grass. "I understand why you did it this way," she said softly to the memory of her husband. "You always did prefer a good story to a simple solution." The light breeze that stirred the leaves felt, just for a moment, like a response. By the following spring, Oak Ridge had transformed. The renovation proceeded, but with significant changes to Brantley's original plans. The historic clubhouse was preserved and restored rather than demolished. New facilities were added that emphasized community, spaces designed for multi-generational gatherings rather than exclusivity. Margaret had stepped back from day-to-day operations, appointing a management team that shared her vision. She maintained her position as board chairperson, attending meetings regularly but delegating most decisions. On the anniversary of her confrontation with Brantley, she hosted a special dinner in the newly renovated ballroom. The guest list included everyone from founding members to the newest families to join, from the groundskeeping staff to the executive team. "Turchi, 1 year ago," Margaret began her toast, her voice still strong despite her 73 years, "I learned something important about legacy. My husband Edward believed that what we build should outlast us, and that how we treat others defines that legacy more than any building or bank account." She gestured around the room. "Look at the connections in this room. People who might never have met if we had continued down the path of increasing exclusivity. This is Oak Ridge's true purpose." Eleanor, seated nearby, discreetly wiped away a tear. After dinner, as guests mingled and the evening softened into night, Michael Brantley approached Margaret. He had remained at Oak Ridge, though in a reduced capacity after several of his initiatives had been reversed. "I underestimated you," he admitted, "and I misunderstood what makes a club like this successful in the long term." Margaret nodded, accepting the closest thing to an apology she was likely to receive. "Communities need both tradition and innovation, Mr. Brantley. Neither works without the other." As the evening concluded, Margaret stood on the terrace overlooking the golf course, now bathed in moonlight. Thomas joined her, offering a cup of tea. Earl Grey, her favorite. "Your Friday afternoon table is always reserved," he told her with a smile. Some traditions should never change. Margaret accepted the tea gratefully. "Thank you, Thomas. Not just for this, for everything this past year." They stood in comfortable silence, watching fireflies begin to appear over the carefully tended grounds. In the distance, the lights of Burlington twinkled like earthbound stars. "Edward would be proud," Thomas said finally. Not just of what you did, but how you did it." Margaret smiled, thinking of the letter she kept in her desk drawer, its paper now soft from multiple readings. "He once told me that every problem is an opportunity in disguise. I didn't fully understand until now." She glanced back toward the ballroom where the last guests lingered. Through the windows, she could see the newly established scholarship committee, her personal project, discussing plans for the summer program that would bring underprivileged children to learn golf and swimming. Another of Edward's dreams, now taking shape. "You know what surprised me most this year?" she said to Thomas. "Not the business aspects or the politics. It was realizing that at 73 I wasn't finished growing yet. Edward knew that before I did." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The best teachers never stop being students themselves. That's what made you both special." As guests began to depart, calling goodnight and thanking her for the evening, Margaret remained on the terrace, savoring the moment of quiet triumph. Not the triumph of ownership or power, but of transformation, of taking something broken and making it whole again, stronger in the mended places. The country club that had once rejected her now stood as a testament to her vision, to Edward's foresight, and to the simple truth that communities thrive when built on inclusion rather than exclusion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under a canopy of stars and surrounded by the legacy she and Edward had built together, Margaret Wilson was exactly where she belonged.